The courtroom fell silent as Judge Eleanor Washington stood before Officer Raymond Keller, the same man who had dragged her out by her arms just hours earlier, calling her another troublemaking ghetto grandma. Now, as she adjusted her judicial robe and stared down at his shocked face, Eleanor felt a mixture of rage and vindication. "Officer Keller, you are hereby found in contempt of court," she announced, her voice unwavering. Little did she know that this confrontation would trigger a chain of events that would threaten not just her career, but her very life. Would justice prevail in a system designed to silence her? Before we dive into this shocking story of injustice and redemption, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. If you believe in true justice and equality under the law, smash that like button and subscribe, because tomorrow's special episode reveals what happens when the entire justice system turns against one powerful woman fighting for what's right. Eleanor Washington arrived at the Westridge District Court in Atlanta earlier than usual that Tuesday morning. At 58, she had served as the first black female chief judge of the district for nearly a decade, earning respect from most of her colleagues and staff. Today, however, she wasn't dressed in her usual professional attire. A burst pipe had flooded her bathroom at 5 a.m., forcing her to leave home in jeans, a simple blouse, and a cardigan. "I'll change in my chambers," she told herself as she parked in her reserved spot. But first, she needed to check on a high-profile domestic violence case scheduled for that morning. The defendant was a prominent businessman with political connections, and Eleanor wanted to ensure all protocols were being followed meticulously. As she entered through the public entrance, she noticed Officer Raymond Keller manning the security checkpoint. At 41, Keller had worked in the courthouse for 15 years and had a reputation among people of color that contrasted sharply with how his fellow officers viewed him. While his colleagues praised his no-nonsense approach, black attorneys and defendants had filed numerous complaints about his aggressive behavior and racial comments. Eleanor nodded politely as she passed the metal detectors, her mind focused on the case. She headed straight for courtroom 3, where pre-trial motions would soon begin. As she reached for the door, Keller's voice boomed from behind her. "Ma'am, what do you think you're doing?" His hand was already on his baton as he approached. Eleanor turned, surprised. "I'm checking on the Williams case before changing into my robes." Keller looked her up and down with undisguised contempt. "Yeah, right. Let me see your court documents or attorney badge." "Officer Keller, I'm Judge Washington. I don't have my robes yet because I'm coming from a home emergency." His eyebrows shot up, and then his face settled into a smirk. "Lady, I know every judge in this building, and you're not one of them. Now step away from the courtroom." "This is ridiculous. I've been chief judge here for 9 years. Call my chambers if you don't believe me." Eleanor's patience was wearing thin. "Listen, if you don't step back right now, I'll have to remove you. We don't need delusional people disrupting court proceedings." Eleanor stood her ground, her dignity under assault, but her resolve unbroken. "I'm going into this courtroom to check on a case which is my right and responsibility as chief judge." When she attempted to move past him toward the door, Keller's reaction was swift and violent. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging painfully into her flesh. "That's it, you're out of here." "Take your hands off me," Eleanor demanded, but Keller only tightened his grip, twisting her arm behind her back. "Another troublemaking ghetto grandma. Who thinks she's special?" he muttered loud enough for her to hear as he began forcibly pushing her toward the exit. People in the hallway started recording on their phones, but no one intervened. Some even laughed, assuming she must have done something to deserve such treatment. Eleanor's protests were ignored as Keller marched her through the lobby, her professional dignity stripped away with each forceful shove. When they reached the front entrance, Keller gave her a final push that sent her tumbling down the courthouse steps. Eleanor fell hard, her head striking the concrete, her clothes tearing at the knee and elbow. The physical pain was nothing compared to the humiliation of lying sprawled on the ground, while onlookers recorded her distress instead of offering help. Blood trickled from her forehead as she struggled to stand, her vision momentarily blurred from the impact. Through the haze of pain and shock, she looked up to see Keller standing at the top of the steps, arms crossed in satisfaction, as if he'd just taken out the trash. Eleanor stumbled to her car, every step a reminder of the assault she had just endured. Her knee throbbed, blood dried on her forehead, and the sleeve of her cardigan was torn at the elbow. The physical wounds would heal, but the humiliation burned deep within her soul. As she reached her vehicle, a familiar voice called out, "Judge Washington!" "Oh my God, what happened?" Marcus Johnson, her 29-year-old clerk, ran toward her. His expression shifted from concern to horror as he took in her disheveled appearance. "Keller," she managed to say, "he threw me out. Wouldn't believe I'm a judge." Marcus helped her into the passenger seat of her own car. "Let me take you to the hospital." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "Take me to my chambers, through the private entrance." As Marcus drove around to the judge's entrance, Eleanor closed her eyes, gathering her strength. In her 25 years in the legal system, she had faced discrimination countless times, but never had she been physically assaulted while simply trying to do her job. Once inside her chambers, Eleanor cleaned her wounds in her private bathroom. Marcus brought her emergency robe from the closet and stood guard outside while she changed. Each movement sent pain through her bruised body, but with every button fastened on her judicial robe, her resolve strengthened. "I need information on Officer Keller," she told Marcus when she emerged, looking every bit the chief judge despite the small bandage on her forehead. "Every complaint, every incident report." Marcus's fingers flew over his keyboard. "There are 17 formal complaints against him in the last 5 years, all from people of color. None resulted in disciplinary action. Who dismissed them?" "Most were reviewed by Judge Richard Harmon." Eleanor nodded. Harmon, the second most senior judge in the district, and Keller's longtime friend and mentor, a man who had made his displeasure at her appointment as chief judge abundantly clear over the years. "Which courtroom is Keller in now?" she asked, straightening her robe. "Still courtroom 3, Marcus replied. "Judge Harmon's preliminary hearing starts in 10 minutes, Eleanor stood, wincing slightly. "Not anymore, it doesn't." She walked through the corridors, her robe flowing behind her, nodding to stunned staff members who clearly didn't expect to see her in this condition. When she reached courtroom 3, she paused, taking a deep breath before pushing the doors open. The courtroom was nearly full when Eleanor entered. Officer Keller stood near the bench laughing with another bailiff. When the doors closed behind her, heads turned and a hush fell over the room. Keller's smile froze on his face as his eyes met hers. For a moment, confusion crossed his features, then dawning recognition followed by undisguised fear. Eleanor walked straight to the bench, her steps measured and determined. She took her place at the center, adjusted her robe, and looked directly at Keller. "Officer Raymond Keller," she spoke, her voice carrying throughout the silent courtroom. "You are hereby found in contempt of court for assault on a judicial officer. You are immediately suspended, pending a full investigation." The color drained from Keller's face. "Your Honor, I didn't know. Whether you knew is irrelevant." "To the fact that you assaulted me," Eleanor stated. "You will surrender your credentials to court security immediately." As another officer moved to take Keller's badge and weapon, the courtroom erupted in whispers. Eleanor brought down her gavel, with authority, restoring order instantly. "Court is adjourned until 2 p.m., at which time Judge Peterson will preside over the scheduled hearing. Officer Keller, you will report to administrative review at 9 a.m. tomorrow." Have you ever witnessed discrimination so blatant it left you speechless? Comment number 1 if you believe Officer Keller got exactly what he deserved, or number 2 if you think Judge Washington should have handled it differently. This moment of vindication might seem like justice served, but was this just the beginning of an even more dangerous battle? Hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see powerful people held accountable for their actions. The question remains, when systems of power and prejudice align against one person speaking truth, what invisible forces might emerge from the shadows to protect the status quo? Judge Richard Harmon was in his chambers when he heard the news. At 62, with silver hair and an imposing presence, he had expected to be chief judge himself until Eleanor Washington had come out of nowhere 9 years ago. He never referred to her as Chief Judge Washington, always just Eleanor or Washington when speaking to colleagues. She did what? Harmon demanded, glaring at his assistant. Suspended Officer Keller for contempt and assault, the assistant repeated. It's all over the courthouse. Harmon's face flushed with anger. Get Tom Miller in here now. 20 minutes later, Court Administrator Thomas Miller slipped into Harmon's chambers, closing the door behind him. At 55, Miller had managed the administrative affairs of the courthouse for 17 years, working closely with Harmon to maintain what they called traditional order. This is a PR nightmare, Miller said, settling into a chair. She can't just suspend an officer without proper procedure. She's playing the race card, Harmon said, his voice low and controlled. We need to get ahead of this narrative. I've already spoken with 3 other judges who are concerned about her emotional reaction, Miller replied, making air quotes. They're willing to back us up. Good. We need to contain this before she turns it into some civil rights crusade. Harmon leaned forward. Get the union rep to file a grievance against her suspension order. I want this portrayed as an overreaction from an emotionally unstable judge. As Harmon and Miller plotted their response, Officer Keller sat across from Police Union Representative Steve Blackwell in the courthouse cafeteria. They can't do this to you, Blackwell assured him. You were doing your job, maintaining courthouse security. She wasn't wearing identification, Keller defended himself. How was I supposed to know she was a judge? She didn't look like one. Blackwell nodded sympathetically. Don't worry. We'll fight this all the way. Judge Harmon has already reached out to express his support. That evening, Eleanor returned to her chambers after a series of meetings to find her door slightly ajar. She paused, certain she had locked it before leaving. Cautiously pushing it open, she surveyed the room. Nothing seemed obviously disturbed, but the air felt different somehow. She called courthouse security, who performed a cursory check. Probably just the cleaning staff, Your Honor, the officer suggested, though the slight disrespect in his tone was unmistakable. Later, reviewing security footage with Marcus, Eleanor discovered the cameras outside her chambers had mysteriously malfunctioned between 3:15 and 3:40 p.m., precisely when she had been in a budget meeting with other judges. This wasn't a coincidence, she told Marcus. The next morning, Eleanor found a note slipped under her chamber door. In crude block letters, it read, "Know your place or find out what happens to people who don't." She had barely processed this threat when Marcus entered, his face grave. "Judge, there's something you need to see." He handed her a printed email that had been circulated to several courthouse staff members. It contained pages from her personnel file, including private therapy, notes from sessions she had attended during her divorce 5 years earlier. Highlighted in yellow were contextless quotes about feeling overwhelmed and anger toward my ex-husband, clearly selected to paint her as emotionally unstable. "How did they get this?" she whispered, her hands shaking slightly. "There's more," Marcus said reluctantly. "Judge Harmon has countermanded your suspension order for Keller. He claims you didn't follow proper administrative procedure and acted out of personal bias." Eleanor sat back, stunned. "He can't do that." "I'm the chief." "Judge!" He cited an obscure procedural rule and got 2 other judges to sign off on it. As if on cue, her phone rang. It was Court Administrator Miller, informing her in an overly formal tone that Officer Keller would be returning to duty effective immediately, though he would be temporarily reassigned to a different courtroom. Eleanor had just hung up when she saw Keller walking past her open door, escorted by Miller. Keller turned his head, making direct eye contact with her. A slow, deliberate smirk spread across his face as he leaned slightly toward her doorway. "You should have stayed in your lane," he whispered, just loud enough for her to hear, before continuing down the hallway with Miller. By the next morning, the video of Eleanor being thrown down the courthouse steps had gone viral, but not in the way she would have hoped. The clip had been edited to start only after she had begun arguing with Keller, removing any context of her explaining she was a judge. The caption read, "Disruptive defendant gets what she deserves after threatening court officer." Eleanor's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Local news outlets wanted statements, but so did national networks, sensing a story with racial undertones. Her inbox filled with messages, some supportive but many hateful, calling her entitled and playing the race card. While Eleanor was attempting to manage this public relations nightmare, Judge Harmon was giving an exclusive interview to Channel 7 News. "While I respect Judge Washington's accomplishments," Harmon said gravely to the camera, "I've observed concerning behavior over recent months. She's been seeing racism where it simply doesn't exist and reacting disproportionately to minor incidents." The reporter nodded sympathetically. "Is it possible that the stress of her position has affected her judgment?" "I didn't want to bring this up," Harmon replied, feigning reluctance, "but there have been concerning episodes of emotional instability. We're all worried about her, really." By afternoon, legal blogs had begun scrutinizing Eleanor's past rulings, finding minor technical errors and blowing them out of proportion. A conservative legal foundation announced they were filing an ethics complaint against her for abuse of power in the Keller suspension. Eleanor sat in her chambers, watching her reputation being dismantled in real time, when her phone rang. It was her daughter, Zora. "Mom, I'm at the airport. I'll be there in an hour." "Zora, you don't need to come. Your work in D.C. is less important than this. I've taken emergency leave. This is coordinated, Mom. They're trying to destroy you." When Zora arrived at the courthouse, she brought the strategic mind that had made her one of the top attorneys at her Washington, D.C. firm. Together, they began mapping out the connections between the attacks. "They're isolating you," Zora observed, "creating a narrative of instability and racial hypersensitivity." Eleanor nodded. "And it's working. 3 staff members have requested transfers from my courtroom since yesterday." Their conversation was interrupted by an email notification. Court Administrator Miller had scheduled Eleanor for 2 simultaneous hearings the following day. "This isn't an accident," Eleanor said. "He's setting me up to fail." The next morning, Eleanor discovered that a crucial judges' meeting had occurred without her. "I thought you were informed," her assistant said nervously. "Mr. Miller said he sent you the updated schedule." Eleanor checked her email. Nothing. Later that day, she entered the courtroom for a high-profile sentencing hearing. The gallery was packed with reporters and observers. As she began reviewing the case file on the bench, her blood ran cold. Key documents had been removed, including the defendant's plea agreement and sentencing recommendations. "Your Honor," the prosecutor prompted after an awkward silence. "Regarding the plea terms we discussed?" Eleanor stared at the incomplete file, aware of every eye in the courtroom watching her apparent confusion. The missing documents made it impossible to proceed correctly, and she knew this was no accident. Requesting a brief recess, she returned to her chambers where Marcus was already searching for the missing papers. "They've been removed from the digital system too," he reported frantically. "It's like they never existed." Eleanor returned to the courtroom and had to adjourn the hearing, citing administrative errors. As cameras flashed and reporters scribbled notes, she caught sight of Court Administrator Miller standing at the back of the room, a satisfied smile playing on his lips. The headlines that evening were devastating. "Chief Judge, unprepared," and "confused during major hearing," and "questions of competence arise as Washington adjourns unexpectedly." What would you do if the entire system you dedicated your life to turned against you overnight? Comment number 1 if you think Judge Washington should fight this conspiracy, or number 2 if you believe she should step back for her own safety. Can one woman stand against a corrupt system designed to protect itself at all costs? Hit subscribe now if you want to see justice prevail against overwhelming odds. The question that haunts this courthouse goes deeper than one racist incident. How can truth survive when those in power will stop at nothing to bury it along with anyone brave enough to speak it? 3 days after the courthouse incident, Eleanor received formal notice that the Judicial Review Board had launched an investigation. The letterhead bore Judge Harmon's name as committee chair, with a list of 5 other judges, all known allies of Harmon as members. "They're not even pretending to be impartial," Zora said, reading over her mother's shoulder. Eleanor scanned the document. "Look at the focus. Investigation into the events of April 15th and related matters of judicial temperament and fitness. They're investigating me, not Keller." "Mom, you need to lawyer up," Zora insisted. "This isn't just office politics anymore." I'm a lawyer," Eleanor reminded her daughter with a tight smile. "And so are you." The next morning, Eleanor received a thick packet of witness statements collected by the review board. As she read through them, her heart sank. 3 courthouse employees claimed to have witnessed her yelling irrationally at Officer Keller before the incident. A clerk from another department described previous concerning outbursts that had never actually occurred. "They're lying," Marcus said, outraged after reading the statements. "Of course they are," Eleanor replied calmly, though her hands trembled slightly. But lies repeated often enough become the truth in people's minds. Later that day, Judge Peterson, once a close colleague, stopped by her chambers. He seemed uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact. "Eleanor, I've been asked to give you a heads up. They've subpoenaed your medical records." "They what? On what grounds?" "Someone mentioned you take medication. They're suggesting it might affect your judgment or emotional stability." Eleanor felt her face flush with anger. She took a mild prescription for hypertension, a common condition. "That's private medical information and completely irrelevant." Peterson shrugged apologetically. "They're building a case that this isn't about race, but about your mental fitness for the position." He paused. "Maybe consider taking some time, off until this blows over." After he left, Eleanor sat at her desk staring at the wall. They were using every tool at their disposal to discredit her, including her private health information. The invasion felt deeply personal, but she recognized the strategy. Make her the subject of the investigation rather than the victim of assault. The final blow came that afternoon when her assistant delivered a formal motion filed by Judge Harmon, requesting that Eleanor recuse herself from any involvement in the investigation due to personal bias and involvement in the matter under review. "He wants me to recuse myself from an investigation into my own assault?" Eleanor asked incredulously. "Gets worse," Marcus said, showing her his laptop screen. "I've been analyzing the court's data for patterns. Look at these bail statistics broken down by race. The numbers were stark. Black defendants were 3 times more likely to have high bail set than white defendants with identical charges, and criminal histories." When Eleanor sorted the data by presiding judge, one name stood out: Richard Harmon. "He's been systematically setting excessive bail for minority defendants for years," Marcus explained. "And guess which private bail bond company most of them are forced to use?" "Let me guess," Eleanor said grimly. "One with connections to Harmon?" "His brother-in-law sits on the board." Eleanor began compiling the data, staying late into the evening. This was no longer just about clearing her name. She had uncovered a pattern of systemic discrimination that affected hundreds of defendants. She was still working when her email pinged with a new high-priority message. Her blood ran cold as she read it. "Notice of investigation for judicial misconduct and creation of a hostile work environment." The document detailed new allegations that she had targeted Officer Keller due to personal animosity and created a hostile work environment through unfounded accusations of racism. The investigation had transformed completely. She was no longer the victim seeking justice, but the perpetrator being investigated. Eleanor parked in front of her house, exhausted after another contentious day at the courthouse. As she approached her front door, she stopped abruptly. Spray painted across her garage door in bold red letters was a single word: liar. Below it, a crude racial slur. Her hands shook as she called the police. When they finally arrived 40 minutes later, the officers seemed disinterested, one of them suggesting, "Probably just kids." "Not much we can do unless you have cameras." Inside, Eleanor found her daughter already removing family photos from the walls. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Installing security cameras," Zora replied grimly. "I ordered them this morning. Had a feeling we'd need them." The next morning, Eleanor discovered all 4 tires of her car had been slashed in the judicial parking garage, an area that required security clearance to enter. As she waited for roadside assistance, Judge Harmon walked by with 2 other judges. "Car trouble, Eleanor?" he asked with mock concern. "Mercury must be in retrograde." The judges with him chuckled as they continued walking. Back in her chambers, Eleanor found 3 request forms on her desk from clerks asking for transfers out of her courtroom. One had worked with her for 6 years. The note attached simply stated, "Seeking new professional opportunities." They're isolating you, Marcus observed, making you toxic to be associated with. You should probably request a transfer too, Eleanor told him. This could hurt your career. Marcus straightened his shoulders. With all due respect, Judge, I'm staying right here. As the days passed, Eleanor noticed how conversations would stop when she entered the break room. Colleagues, who once greeted her warmly, now gave curt nods or found reasons to hurry in another direction. The isolation was calculated and effective. The stress began manifesting physically. During a hearing, Eleanor felt her heart racing uncontrollably, her vision narrowing to a pinpoint. She called a 10-minute recess and sat in her chambers, practicing the breathing techniques her doctor had recommended, fighting the anxiety attack that threatened to overwhelm her. No one can know, she told herself firmly. They'll use it against me. That evening, Zora made a disturbing discovery while checking her mother's phones. Mom, I think your phones are being monitored. There's software on here that shouldn't be. Are you sure? I worked cybersecurity cases for 2 years. Someone's listening to your calls and probably reading your texts and emails too. Eleanor felt violated all over again. They're watching everything I do, which means you're getting close to something they don't want found. The next morning, a large bouquet arrived at Eleanor's chambers. The card read, "Deepest condolences on your loss." There was no signature. What loss? Marcus asked, confused. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. It's a threat. They're telling me I've already lost or I'm going to lose something dear to me. That night, Eleanor returned home, exhausted. As she entered her bathroom to take her blood pressure medication, she froze in the doorway. Taped to her bathroom mirror were photographs of her getting coffee that morning, of her and Zora talking in the park the previous day, of her checking her mailbox in her robe. Someone had been following her, photographing her daily routine. Someone had been inside her home. Have you ever felt targeted for standing up for what's right? Comment number 1 if you think Eleanor should involve federal authorities now, or number 2 if you believe she needs to gather more evidence first. How far would you go to protect your reputation and safety when powerful forces align against you? Hit that subscribe button if you believe one person's courage can expose an entire corrupt system. The question remains, when the very walls of your home no longer offer safety, and those sworn to protect the law are breaking it to destroy, who can you trust with the truth that might save not just your career, but your life? Eleanor and Zora spent the night in a hotel after discovering the photographs. They reported the break-in to the police, but Eleanor had little faith that the investigation would be pursued vigorously. We need allies, Zora insisted over breakfast. You can't fight this alone. I'm the chief judge, and I can't even trust my own colleagues, Eleanor replied bitterly. Who exactly is going to stand with me against this? She received her answer later that morning in the form of Vanessa Chen, a court reporter who had worked in the Westridge District Court for 15 years. Vanessa knocked tentatively on Eleanor's chamber door during the lunch break. Judge Washington, may I speak with you privately? Eleanor nodded and Marcus discreetly left the room. I have something you should hear, Vanessa said, placing a small recording device on the desk. I've been recording the courtroom audio for official transcripts, but sometimes I forget to turn it off during breaks. She pressed play. Officer. Keller's voice filled the room. Just another entitled black woman who got her position because of affirmative action. Someone needs to remind her she's not really in charge here. Judge Harmon's laugh followed. Don't worry, this little crusade of hers won't last long. She'll be gone by the end of the month if she knows what's good for her. Eleanor stared at the device. You realize what you're doing by bringing this to me? Vanessa nodded grimly. I've seen how they treat people who don't fit their idea of what belongs in this courthouse. My parents were Vietnamese refugees. I know what discrimination looks like even when it wears a suit or a uniform. With Vanessa's encouragement, Eleanor began reaching out to others who might have experienced discrimination from Keller or Harmon. Slowly, cautiously, people began to come forward. A Spanish-speaking defendant who had been denied an interpreter by Keller, a Muslim attorney who had been subjected to random additional security checks whenever she appeared in Harmon's courtroom. Each story reinforced the pattern, but few were willing to go on record fearing retaliation. A breakthrough came when Junior Judge Michael Okafor requested a private meeting with Eleanor. At 35, he was the newest judge in the district and had largely kept to himself during the unfolding controversy. "Judge Washington, I've been gathering information," he said, sliding a flash drive across her desk. "Financial records, meeting minutes, official communications that seemed to disappear from the system." Eleanor picked up the drive. "Why are you doing this?" "Because before I was a judge, I was a public defender. I've seen what happens to black defendants in Judge Harmon's courtroom. This isn't about one incident with you and Keller. It's systematic." The flash drive contained a treasure trove of information, including emails between Harmon and Court Administrator Miller, discussing how to manage the Washington situation and ensure the right kinds of defendants get processed efficiently. Eleanor's next unexpected ally came in the form of retired Judge Gloria Patterson, who had been the first woman appointed to the Westridge bench 20 years earlier. Judge Patterson arrived at Eleanor's home one evening, declining to call ahead. "Phones aren't safe," the 70-year-old judge explained. "I went through something similar my second year on the bench. Not as severe, I'm white, which gave me some protection, but the same playbook. Isolation, gaslighting, manufactured evidence of incompetence." "How did you survive it?" Eleanor asked. "I found their weak spot. Follow the money. That's why they're coming after you so hard you've stumbled onto something they can't afford to have exposed." With this guidance, Eleanor, Zora, and Marcus began investigating the financial connections between the key players. It was Marcus who discovered the link to private detention facilities. "Judge Harmon sits on the advisory board of Meridian Correctional Services," he explained, showing Eleanor the company's publicly available tax documents. "They operate pre-trial detention facilities in 3 counties. And Miller?" Eleanor asked. "His brother-in-law is their CFO." The final piece of the puzzle came from Damon Rivers, a local journalist known for his investigations into corruption. He approached Eleanor after a hearing, slipping her his card with a note on the back. "Coffee at Regency Hotel, 7 p.m. Come alone." At the meeting, Rivers revealed that he had been investigating Harmon and several other judges for months. "They're sending defendants to Meridian facilities at 3 times the rate of other jurisdictions," Rivers explained. "And the longer defendants stay in pre-trial detention, the more money Meridian makes." Which explains the excessive bail amounts, Eleanor realized. "They're deliberately keeping people who can't afford bail locked up longer." "Exactly. And guess who sets a disproportionate number of those high bails?" "Harmon." Rivers nodded. "And half a dozen other judges who all seem to have financial ties to Meridian through family members, consulting fees, or speaking engagements." As Eleanor digested this information, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It contained a single file, a whistleblower report, that had been buried in the court's administrative system, detailing how certain judges received consulting fees from Meridian that directly correlated with the number of defendants they sent to Meridian facilities. The pieces were finally coming together. This wasn't just about racism or one incident with Keller. It was about money, power, and a systematic exploitation of vulnerable defendants, many of whom were people of color. Eleanor awoke to an urgent call from her bank at 6:30 a.m. The fraud department had detected unusual activity on her accounts overnight, specifically deposits totaling $95,000 from multiple offshore sources. "I didn't make those deposits," Eleanor told the bank representative, her heart racing. "This isn't my money." "The deposits appear to have proper authorization codes, Judge Washington," the representative replied. "We're required to file reports for any deposits over $10,000 with federal authorities." Eleanor immediately understood the implications. Someone had access to her banking information and was deliberately setting her up to appear as though she was receiving bribes or laundering money. She called Zora, who sprang into action, contacting the bank's legal department and documenting everything. By noon, however, the damage was already spreading. Anonymous tips had been sent to the FBI and the State Judicial Ethics Committee, claiming that Eleanor was accepting bribes in exchange for favorable rulings. The tips included detailed information about the deposits and suggestions of where to look for additional evidence. Eleanor was in a hearing when FBI agents Daniels and Rodriguez entered her courtroom. They waited until she recessed before approaching. "Judge Washington, "We need to speak with you regarding an ongoing investigation," Agent Daniels stated formally. In her chambers, they questioned her about the mysterious deposits, her relationship with several defendants who had appeared in her courtroom, and her recent financial decisions. Their questions made it clear that they were investigating her, not helping her identify who had framed her. "Am I under investigation?" Eleanor asked directly. "We're following evidence where it leads us, Your Honor," Agent Rodriguez replied non-committally. Later, that afternoon, Eleanor returned home to find FBI agents executing a search warrant. Zora stood on the sidewalk, prevented from entering. "They've been here for 2 hours, Zora told her mother. "I've called our attorney." Inside, the house had been thoroughly searched. Agents were boxing evidence, including Eleanor's laptop and financial documents. In her home office, an agent held up an evidence bag containing an envelope. "Judge Washington, can you explain why you have $15,000 in cash hidden in your office?" Eleanor stared at the envelope in shock. "That's not mine. I've never seen that before." The agent's expression made it clear he didn't believe her. By evening, the story had leaked to the media. Local news led with "Federal Investigation Targets Chief Judge" and "Corruption Probe Expands to Courthouse Leadership." Judge Harmon gave a solemn statement expressing his deep disappointment and concern, while carefully noting that everyone deserves the presumption of innocence. The next morning, Eleanor arrived at the courthouse to find Court Administrator Miller waiting for her, flanked by 2 security officers, neither of whom was Keller. "Judge Washington, in light of the federal investigation, the Judicial Board has voted to suspend you pending resolution of these serious allegations." Miller handed her an official letter. "I'll need your courthouse access card and credentials." "This is a setup, Tom." "You know it," Eleanor said quietly. Miller's expression remained impassive. "Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings from your chambers." As Eleanor cleared out her desk under watchful eyes, Judge Harmon appeared in her doorway. "Such a shame it's come to this, Eleanor." She looked up at him. "Why the elaborate frame job? You could have just fabricated complaints about my conduct." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Because this way, you're not just removed, you're disgraced. No one will believe anything you say about our court ever again." He smiled thinly. "Consider this a lesson in real power." As security escorted her through the courthouse, Eleanor held her head high despite the whispers and stares. At the main entrance, the same steps where Keller had thrown her down days earlier, a group of reporters waited with cameras. "Judge Washington, are you being arrested? Did you accept bribes from defendants? Are you resigning your position?" She said nothing as she walked through the gauntlet of questions. Court Administrator Miller stood at the top of the steps, watching her humiliation with satisfaction. The final blow came 3 hours later when Eleanor's attorney called. "They filed charges, Eleanor. Federal corruption charges. They're alleging you accepted bribes to influence case outcomes." "When is the arraignment?" she asked, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Tomorrow morning. I've arranged for your surrender to avoid a public arrest." After hanging up, Eleanor sat in stunned silence in her living room, where just weeks ago she had felt secure in her position and proud of her accomplishments. Now she faced the destruction of her career, her reputation, and potentially her freedom. Zora found her there, still sitting in the growing darkness. "Mom, we're not giving up. This frame-up means you were getting too close to something they desperately need to hide. They have federal charges, planted evidence, and my reputation is in tatters," Eleanor replied. "What exactly is our next move?" "We fight back," Zora said firmly, "not just to defend you, but to expose them." "What would you do if your entire life's work was being destroyed by a corrupt system you once believed in?" Comment number 1, if you think Eleanor should go public with everything she knows immediately, or comment number 2, if you believe she should build her case secretly before striking back. When faced with overwhelming power and injustice, is it better to fight loudly or strike strategically from the shadows? Hit that subscribe button if you believe the truth can still triumph even when buried under carefully constructed lies. As Eleanor faces the darkest moment of her career, a critical question emerges. In a system designed to protect itself at all costs, how can one framed judge expose a conspiracy so vast without becoming its next victim? "We need a war room," Zora announced the morning after Eleanor's arraignment. The judge had been released on her own recognizance, a small mercy that came with the humiliation of a monitoring ankle bracelet and strict instructions not to leave the county. The arraignment had been a media circus, with cameras capturing her walk into the federal courthouse from every angle. They converted Eleanor's dining room into a command center. Zora had taken an indefinite leave from her D.C. law firm, and Marcus had been suspended from the courthouse after refusing to cooperate with what he called a sham investigation into Eleanor. "First rule of strategic defense," Zora said, taping a large sheet of paper to the wall. "Understand what they want to protect most." "Money," Eleanor replied immediately. "The connection between Harmon, Miller, and Meridian Correctional Services." Marcus nodded, typing on his laptop. "I've been analyzing the data I downloaded before they locked me out. There's a clear pattern of defendants who couldn't afford bail being sent specifically to Meridian facilities. And Harmon set bail high enough to ensure they couldn't pay it," Eleanor added, "particularly for defendants of color." Zora wrote on the paper, "Follow the money. We need more evidence," she said. "Concrete proof of kickbacks or profits tied directly to judicial decisions. The courthouse records might contain that evidence." "But we're all locked out now," Marcus pointed out. Eleanor considered this problem. "Not everyone is against us. Vanessa Chen, the court reporter, Judge Okafor, they still have access." "It's risky for them," Zora cautioned. "Which is why we need to be strategic about what we ask for," Eleanor agreed. "We need to identify exactly what documents would prove the connection." Over the next 3 days, they built a detailed map of the corruption network. Marcus's data analysis revealed that defendants assigned to certain judges, particularly Harmon, and 4 others, were 3 times more likely to be held on bail they couldn't afford. Those defendants were almost exclusively sent to Meridian facilities, where they would often wait months for trial dates that kept getting mysteriously delayed. "The longer they stay, the more Meridian bills the county," Eleanor explained. "And somehow that money finds its way back to the judges making these decisions." Zora had been researching Meridian's corporate structure. "They're clever. The company itself looks clean, but they have a network of consultancy firms and subsidiaries. One of them, Westwood Judicial Advisors, pays consulting fees to 7 judges in our district." "Let me guess, Harmon being one of them?" Eleanor asked, chairman of their advisory board. "Paid $200,000 last year for strategic consulting services." Eleanor shook her head in disgust. "And Miller? His brother-in-law is the CFO of Meridian, but there's more. Miller's wife owns a company that provides commissary services to 3 Meridian facilities. They made over $500,000 last year." With this framework established, they identified key documents that would prove the corruption: internal emails, financial records, meeting minutes, and bail determination patterns. Eleanor reached out to civil rights attorney Benjamin Taylor, who had successfully challenged systemic discrimination in other jurisdictions. After reviewing their evidence, he agreed to take the case. "This isn't just about clearing your name," Taylor told Eleanor. "This is about exposing a racist system of profit-driven incarceration. If we can prove this, it won't just be Harmony and Miller who fall. This could change how bail is set across the state." With careful coordination, their allies inside the courthouse began gathering critical documents. Judge Okafor provided sealed meeting minutes showing Harmon and other judges discussing population management at detention facilities. Vanessa Chen secretly copied emails mentioning quotas and revenue targets for the county's jail system. The most dangerous mission fell to Marcus. Despite his suspension, he used his still-active security credentials to enter the courthouse at night and copy financial records showing the correlation between specific judges' bail decisions and payments to their consulting companies. "If I'm caught, I'm facing serious charges," he told Eleanor. "You don't have to do this," she assured him. "Yes, I do," he replied firmly. "This is about justice." The risks became all too real when Vanessa Chen was attacked in the courthouse parking garage. After her shift, a hooded figure struck her from behind, stealing her purse and laptop. She suffered a concussion and a broken wrist, but the attack had a clear message. Someone knew she was helping Eleanor. Despite the danger, their evidence collection continued. Eleanor and Zora worked with journalist Damon Rivers, carefully sharing information that he could verify through independent sources. Rivers began publishing a series of articles about troubling patterns in the county's bail practices, though he didn't yet name specific judges. The breakthrough came when they discovered documents showing that Meridian Correctional Services had contractual quotas with the county minimum numbers of detainees that the county was obligated to provide or pay penalties. This created a direct financial incentive for judges to deny bail or set it prohibitively high. "This is it," Eleanor said, reviewing the contract. "This proves the system is designed to keep people locked up, not to serve justice." As they prepared to take their evidence to federal authorities, Eleanor received an unexpected call from Officer Keller. "I need to meet," he said, his voice low and nervous. "I have information you need to hear." "Why would I trust you?" Eleanor asked coldly. "Because they're setting me up to take the fall if this all comes down. I was following orders, but they'll sacrifice me in a heartbeat to protect themselves." The next day, in a diner 30 miles outside Atlanta, Keller sat across from Eleanor and Zora, his eyes constantly darting to the door. "Harmon told me to target you that day," he admitted. "He said if you came to courtroom 3, find a reason to remove you, make it public, make it humiliating." "Why?" Eleanor demanded. "Because you were getting too close to their operation. You'd been asking questions about bail statistics, reviewing Harmon's decisions." Keller leaned forward. "They've been running this scheme for years. Harmon, Miller, 3 other judges. They decide who stays locked up based on who can pay and who can't, and they all profit from it." "We need you to go on record," Zora said. Keller shook his head. "They'll kill me, but I can give you something better." He slid a thumb drive across the table. "Audio recordings. Harmon giving me direct orders to, quote, take care of the Washington situation. And a video of him and Miller discussing how their investment in Meridian pays off every time they deny bail." As they left the meeting, Eleanor's phone buzzed with a news alert. The state attorney general had just announced an investigation into judicial misconduct in the Westridge district, citing disturbing evidence of potential corruption. "They know we're getting close," Zora said. "They'll try something desperate." She was right. The next day, as Eleanor returned from a meeting with her attorney, she found Keller waiting in her driveway, his face contorted with panic and rage. "They know I talked to you," he shouted, advancing toward her. "They're going to pin everything on me." When he pulled a gun from his jacket, Eleanor froze. "Raymond, don't do this. We can protect you." "It's too late," he said, raising the weapon. Before he could fire, a car screeched into the driveway. Courthouse security officer Monica Diaz leapt out, her own weapon drawn. "Drop it, Keller," she commanded. For a moment the world paused as Keller stood with his gun pointed at Eleanor. Then slowly he lowered the weapon and sank to his knees. "I was just following orders," he repeated as Monica handcuffed him. "Just following orders." The attempted assault by Keller became front-page news, but this time the narrative had begun to shift. Journalist Damon Rivers published his most explosive article yet, titled "Corruption in the Courthouse: How Profit Drives Incarceration in Westridge County." The article detailed the financial connections between judges, court administrators, and private detention facilities, though it stopped short of naming specific individuals pending the state attorney general's investigation. It described a system designed to keep certain defendants, primarily people of color, and the economically disadvantaged incarcerated for longer periods to meet quotas and generate profits. The public reaction was immediate and powerful. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse demanding accountability. The State Bar Association called for an independent investigation. 3 state senators requested federal intervention to examine potential civil rights violations. Inside the courthouse, panic spread among those involved. Judge Harmon called an emergency meeting with his allies in his chambers. "We need to contain this," he insisted. "Rivers doesn't have names yet. We find the leak and discredit it." Court Administrator Miller paced nervously. Keller tried to shoot. "Washington, this is spinning out of control. Keller is unstable, we use that. He's a disgruntled employee making wild accusations," Harmon countered. "As for Washington, we stick to our story." She's corrupt, emotionally unstable, and fabricating conspiracy theories to distract from her own crimes. What they didn't know was that Eleanor and her team had anticipated this response. With Officer Diaz's help, they had planted recording devices in Harmon's chambers, capturing this very conversation. The next morning, 3 more courthouse employees came forward with evidence. A clerk provided emails showing instructions to delay certain cases based on a defendant's ability to pay. A financial officer supplied documents showing unusual consulting payments to judges who consistently denied bail. A security guard offered footage of late-night meetings between Harmon Miller and executives from Meridian Correctional Services. Eleanor, working with attorney Benjamin Taylor, compiled all this evidence into a comprehensive report detailing years of systematic corruption and discrimination. They submitted it simultaneously to the State Attorney General, the FBI, and the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. "This isn't just about clearing your name anymore," Taylor told Eleanor. "This is about fundamental reform of a broken system." The State Attorney General moved swiftly, expanding the investigation and appointing a special prosecutor. FBI agents different from those who had investigated Eleanor began interviewing courthouse staff and reviewing financial records. Judge Harmon, sensing the walls closing in, made a calculated decision. He approached Eleanor through intermediaries, offering a deal. He would drop all allegations against her if she would agree to limit the scope of her accusations and allow him to retire quietly. "He's desperate," Zora observed when Eleanor showed her the message. "And he still doesn't understand who he's dealing with," Eleanor replied, drafting her response, a firm rejection and a promise to pursue justice to its fullest extent. Harmon's next move was to approach Keller in custody, sending a message through a corrections officer. "Stay silent and you'll be taken care of. Talk and you won't live to see trial." But Keller, facing serious charges and abandoned by his former allies, made his own calculation. He contacted Eleanor's attorney, offering to testify against Harmon and Miller in exchange for consideration in his own case. "I was following direct orders," Keller explained in a recorded statement. "Harmon told me to target black defendants for additional security screenings, to recommend against bail in their cases, and to create an atmosphere of intimidation." He described regular meetings where judges and administrators would review the numbers detainees sent to Meridian facilities and celebrate when they met their targets. He revealed how court dates were deliberately delayed to extend pre-trial detention periods, generating more revenue for Meridian and, by extension, those with financial interests in the company. Most damaging of all, Keller produced a recording of Harmon explicitly instructing him to take care of the Washington situation by any means necessary, adding, "If she gets too close to what we're doing, she needs to be stopped." As this evidence became public, the State Attorney General announced formal charges against Judge Richard Harmon and Court Administrator Thomas Miller for corruption, abuse of power, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. 4 other judges were placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. The courthouse was in chaos. Staff members who had witnessed the corruption for years but remained silent out of fear now came forward with their own accounts. Cases presided over by the implicated judges were placed under review, with hundreds of defendants potentially eligible for new bail hearings or even dismissals. Through it all, Eleanor remained focused on the bigger picture, not just accountability for individuals, but reform of the system that had allowed this corruption to flourish. She worked with civil rights organizations to draft proposed legislation requiring transparency in bail decisions, prohibiting financial connections between the judiciary and detention facilities, and creating independent oversight of court operations. Just as it seemed the conspiracy had been fully exposed, Harmon made one final desperate attempt to salvage his reputation. In a press conference called by his attorney, he produced documents purporting to show that Eleanor had been aware of the relationship between the court and Meridian for years, and had tacitly approved it by not raising objections. "Judge Washington is not the whistleblower she claims to be," Harmon's attorney stated. "She was complicit in this system until it became politically advantageous for her to position herself as its victim." This new allegation threatened to undermine everything Eleanor had worked for. If the public believed she had known about the corruption and done nothing, her moral authority would be compromised, and the momentum for systemic reform might be lost. The stage was set for a final confrontation between Eleanor and Harmon, a public hearing where both would testify under oath about what they knew and when they knew it. The outcome would determine not just their personal fates, but the future of justice in Westridge County. The special judicial hearing was scheduled for 3 consecutive days at the federal courthouse in Atlanta. To ensure impartiality, a panel of 3 judges from different districts would preside, with the State Attorney General's office presenting evidence and questioning witnesses. The hearing room was packed to capacity each day, with overflow crowds watching on monitors in adjacent rooms. National media covered the proceedings, recognizing that what was happening in Westridge County reflected broader issues of judicial corruption, racial discrimination, and the privatization of justice across the country. Eleanor arrived for the first day flanked by Zora and attorney Benjamin Taylor. She walked past a group of supporters holding signs reading "Justice for Judge Washington" and "End Corrupt Courts." Inside, she saw Harmon and Miller seated with their legal teams, both men looking considerably older and more diminished than they had just weeks earlier. The State Attorney General's office presented its case methodically, laying out the financial connections between the judges and Meridian Correctional Services, the statistical evidence of discriminatory bail practices, and the testimony of multiple courthouse employees describing a culture of corruption and intimidation. Vanessa Chen, her arm still in a cast from the parking garage attack, testified about the racist comments she had recorded and the pattern of discrimination she had witnessed over 15 years. Officer Keller and others would joke about meeting their quotas whenever they processed black defendants, she explained. It was common knowledge that certain judges, particularly Judge Harmon, would set bail beyond what these defendants could possibly afford. Judge Michael Okafor testified about the pressure he had faced to conform to these practices when he joined the bench. "I was told it was just how things worked in Westridge," he stated. "When I questioned the disparities in bail decisions, I was excluded from meetings and assignments. It was made clear that advancement depended on being a team player." Marcus presented his statistical analysis showing that black defendants appearing before Judge Harmon were 4 times more likely to be denied bail than white defendants with identical charges and criminal histories. He demonstrated how these denials correlated directly with increased populations at Meridian facilities and subsequent payments to Harmon's consulting company. On the second day, Officer Keller testified, describing in detail how he had been directed to target certain defendants and to intimidate anyone who questioned the system. His account of the assault on Eleanor was particularly damning. "Judge Harmon told me to make an example of her," Keller admitted. "He said she was getting too close to their operation and needed to be put in her place. I was told if I didn't handle it, someone else would, and I'd be considered part of the problem." Court Administrator Miller was called next. Under intense questioning, he eventually acknowledged his family's financial interest in Meridian and admitted to manipulating court schedules to benefit certain judges and disadvantage others, including Eleanor. "It wasn't personal at first," Miller claimed. "It was just business." But when Judge Washington started asking questions about the bail statistics, Harmon became concerned. He said she could ruin everything they had built. On the third day, Judge Harmon took the stand. Despite the mounting evidence against him, he remained defiant, portraying himself as a dedicated public servant, being scapegoated for systemic issues beyond his control. "Yes, I served as an advisor to Meridian, but that was public knowledge," he insisted. "There was no conflict of interest. My bail decisions were based solely on the facts of each case and the law." When confronted with the recordings of his conversations with Keller, including his explicit instructions to take care of Eleanor, Harmon claimed his words had been taken out of context. "I simply meant that Officer Keller should ensure courthouse security protocols were followed," he claimed, a statement that drew audible scoffs from the audience. Then came Harmon's final attack, the documents purporting to show Eleanor's prior knowledge of the arrangement with Meridian. He testified that Eleanor had attended meetings where these relationships were discussed, and had signed off on reports detailing the court's contract with Meridian. Judge Washington is presenting herself as a whistleblower and victim, but she was aware of these arrangements for years and raised no objections until it became personally advantageous for her to do so, Harmon claimed. This was the moment Eleanor and her team had prepared for. When it was her turn to testify, she systematically dismantled Harmon's allegations. The documents Judge Harmon presented have been selectively edited, she explained, presenting the original versions that showed significant differences. The meetings he referenced were budget discussions, where the contracts were listed without details of the financial arrangements or quotas. Eleanor then presented evidence that she had begun investigating the bail disparities months before the incident, with Keller, including emails to the State Administrative Office of Courts requesting data analysis tools and resources. Far from being complicit, I was actively working to understand and address these disparities, she testified. That investigation is precisely what made me a target. Her testimony was compelling, measured, and powerful. She spoke not just about her own experience, but about the hundreds of defendants, primarily people of color, who had been unjustly detained for longer periods due to this corrupt system. This hearing is not ultimately about me or even Judge Harmon, she concluded. It's about whether our justice system truly serves justice or whether it serves profit and prejudice at the expense of those most vulnerable. The answer to that question will determine what kind of society we choose to be. After 3 days of testimony, the evidence against Harmon, Miller, and the others was overwhelming. The panel announced they would issue their findings within a week, but the public verdict seemed clear. National headlines described "Shocking Corruption Exposed in Georgia Courthouse" and "Profit-Driven Justice, the West Ridge County Scandal." Eleanor left the courthouse on the final day. She was met by a crowd of supporters, much larger than before. Among them were former defendants who had been affected by the corrupt bail practices, courthouse employees who had found the courage to speak out, and community members demanding reform. For the first time in weeks, Eleanor felt the weight lifting. Whatever the panel decided, the truth had been exposed, and the system that had nearly destroyed her was itself now on trial. 1 week after the conclusion of the hearing, the judicial panel released its findings in a scathing 100-page report. They determined that Judge Richard Harmon, Court Administrator Thomas Miller, and 4 other judges had engaged in a systematic effort to exploit the bail system for personal financial gain, with a disproportionate impact on minority defendants. The panel recommended criminal charges for all involved, the immediate removal of Harmon and the other judges from the bench, and a complete overhaul of the West Ridge District Court's operations. Most importantly for Eleanor, they concluded that she had been deliberately targeted for raising legitimate concerns about disparities in the bail system, and that the allegations against her were fabricated as part of a coordinated effort to discredit and remove her. The State Attorney General announced that all charges against Eleanor had been dropped and that her record would be fully expunged. The FBI investigation into her was officially closed with a rare public statement acknowledging that she had been wrongfully accused. 3 days later, Eleanor Washington returned to the West Ridge Courthouse, not through the public entrance where Keller had assaulted her, but through the main doors, wearing her judicial robe. A crowd of well-wishers and media had gathered to witness her return. Court staff lined the hallways, many applauding as she passed. In her chambers, now cleared of the surveillance devices that had been planted there, she found her desk restored, with her personal items and a large bouquet of flowers from the courthouse staff, with a card reading simply, "Justice Prevails." In the weeks that followed, the full extent of the conspiracy continued to unfold. Judge Harmon, Court Administrator Miller, and 2 other judges were indicted on multiple federal charges, including racketeering, corruption, civil rights violations, and obstruction of justice. Officer Keller, in exchange for his testimony, received a reduced sentence for his role in the assault on Eleanor and other misconduct. Meridian Correctional Services faced multiple investigations and lawsuits. Their contracts with the county were terminated, and the company eventually filed for bankruptcy, as similar scandals emerged in other jurisdictions where they operated. Most significantly, over 300 defendants who had been detained due to excessive bail were released or granted new hearings. A class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of those who had been unjustly incarcerated, ultimately resulting in a multi-million-dollar settlement and the establishment of a community restitution fund. As the most senior judge remaining after the removals, Eleanor was appointed acting chief judge with expanded authority to implement reforms. She didn't waste the opportunity. Working with Judge Okafor and several newly appointed judges, Eleanor established new bail guidelines, emphasizing the presumption of release and prohibiting the consideration of a defendant's financial resources, except in extraordinary circumstances. She implemented mandatory training on implicit bias and structural racism for all courthouse personnel, and created a transparent system for handling complaints of discrimination or misconduct. Eleanor also established an independent oversight committee comprising community members, legal experts, and former defendants to review court practices and ensure accountability. The committee's public meetings became a model for other jurisdictions seeking to rebuild trust in their justice systems. Perhaps most personally meaningful to Eleanor was the mentorship program she created for minority law students interested in careers as public defenders or judges. The Westridge Legal Fellowship provided scholarships, internships, and professional development opportunities, with a particular focus on students from underrepresented backgrounds. The best way to transform a system is to change who operates it, she explained at the program's launch. Justice requires perspectives from all communities, especially those that have historically been marginalized by the legal system. 1 year after the day Keller had thrown her down the courthouse steps, Eleanor sat in her chambers, reviewing applications for a newly created judgeship. The position had been established as part of the court's expansion and reform efforts, with a specific focus on equitable sentencing and alternatives to incarceration. Among the applications was one from Zora Washington, who had decided to leave her corporate law practice in D.C. to follow in her mother's footsteps. Her personal statement described how witnessing her mother's fight for justice had inspired her to recommit herself to public service. As Eleanor read her daughter's powerful words about transforming systems from within, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. What had begun as a personal humiliation had evolved into a movement for reform that was now spreading beyond Westridge County to jurisdictions across the state. Judge Richard Harmon, awaiting trial and facing the prospect of spending his remaining years in prison, had sought to destroy her. Instead, he had inadvertently given her the platform and purpose to accomplish what might otherwise have taken decades: fundamental change in a system that had for too long served power and privilege rather than justice. Eleanor placed Zora's application in the Recommend for Interview folder. The final decision wasn't hers alone. That would be made by a diverse committee including judges, attorneys, and community representatives, but she couldn't help feeling a sense of completion in the possibility that her daughter might help continue the work she had begun. Justice, Eleanor had learned, wasn't an achievement but a process, one that required constant vigilance, courage, and a willingness to stand firm even when the cost was high. The system had tried to break her, but instead she had transformed it, creating ripples of change that would continue long after her own time on the bench had ended. As she closed the folder on her desk, Eleanor Washington smiled, remembering how far they had come from that moment on the courthouse steps, and knowing that the true measure of justice was not in retribution for past wrongs, but in building a future where such wrongs would no longer be possible. Eleanor Washington's journey teaches us that true justice requires courage to stand against systemic corruption. When faced with discrimination, she didn't just fight for personal vindication, she exposed an entire network of exploitation that disproportionately harmed people of color. Her story reminds us that power often protects itself through intimidation, isolation, and character assassination, but these tactics only succeed when good people remain silent. The conspiracy against Eleanor shows how racism can become institutionalized, hiding behind procedures and business as usual. It reveals how discrimination isn't always about individual prejudice, but can become embedded in systems that generate profit from inequity. Perhaps most importantly, Eleanor's victory demonstrates that meaningful change requires both personal resilience and strategic coalition building. By finding allies across different backgrounds and positions, she transformed an individual injustice into a movement for reform. The ultimate lesson is that justice isn't a destination, but an ongoing commitment. Even after vindication, Eleanor continued working to rebuild a more equitable system, understanding that dismantling deeply rooted discrimination requires not just exposing wrongdoing, but creating new structures that protect the vulnerable and amplify marginalized voices. Has a system you once believed in ever betrayed your trust? Eleanor Washington's story shows us that sometimes the greatest courage is standing up to injustice, even when everyone expects you to back down. Have you ever witnessed discrimination and wished you had spoken up? Or perhaps you've been the Eleanor in your own story, fighting against powerful forces trying to silence you? Share your experiences in the comments below. We can learn so much from each other's journeys toward justice. If Eleanor's strength and determination inspired you, hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories of extraordinary people fighting against systemic injustice. Remember, just as Eleanor found unexpected allies in her darkest moments, your voice might be the support someone else needs right now. Thank you for joining us in this powerful story of resilience, and may we all find the courage to stand for what's right, even when it's difficult.